answer.
Listen to AM 560 The Answer online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560 The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Lots to talk about, so let's get right to it. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a celebrated astrophysicist. He's also the author and executive producer of a new documentary entitled Shot in the Arm. Neil deGrasse Tyson, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Yeah, thanks for having me on this, and good morning.
Yes, good morning. So the documentary, as I've read the reviews, I haven't had a chance to see it yet. I know it just previewed in the last couple of weeks. Give us, in part, it seems to tackle supposed misinformation associated with COVID, the vaccines, science in general, perhaps. So give us an overview, if you would.
Yeah, so it just premiered at the Palm Springs International Film Festival in California. And my association with the project is sort of as an educator. It's actually the brainchild of Scott Hamilton Kennedy, he's an award-winning documentarian. And my affiliation with it is as educator, as a science educator, as this other hat that I wear, in addition to being an astrophysicist. And this film is all about exploring the roots of vaccine hesitancy, basically. And I think the title of the film is very clever, Shot in the Arm. And it takes a compassionate look at people who are trying to make a decision for themselves, and they're exposed to all manner of claims, especially brought to them via the internet. And the question is, how do you then decide? And the project was birthed at a time when vaccines were on the down. Vaccines were on the drop before COVID, and when vaccines were when parents were no longer vaccinating their children in certain pockets across the country, what we saw was that measles came back. Measles was a disease that was declared conquered, right, in the year 2000 across the United States. And so there are consequences when people don't vaccine either themselves or vaccinate either themselves or their children. So it's an hour-and-a-half documentary just exploring all the reasons and means and occasions why people have rejected vaccines, and then it shows why, in the total picture and the statistics of the likelihood of catching a disease, the efficacy of vaccines, and it shows why people are not always making decisions that are in their own interest.
But how could this be a vaccine if you have to get a shot every 3 to 4 months? I mean, we're on number 4, number 5's right down the pipe. Because chickenpox, you get one vaccine.
Yeah, so you were not surprised. You were not surprised in any given year that there's a new flu vaccine, correct?
Right.
Right. I mean, that's a cult. The flu evolves, it mutates annually, and so yeah, let's get this year's flu vaccine, which has which is targeted to the emergent virus that we see coming out in regions of the world before it ends up getting to the United States. So it may be that COVID becomes one of these things where there's an annual vaccine to prevent you from getting it. That would not be a weird fact. I not specifically being a medical expert, although many medical experts are interviewed in this film. So it's their expertise that's being shared with the public. I'm there guiding sort of script points about how to be most effective communicating information. But the point is, there's some other diseases where one vaccine fixed it forever, right? And like polio, for example. Sure. But not all diseases have the same arc of of evolution in our population. And so that's what we're learning. It was a novel virus discovered in 2019. So people need to recognize that as emergent knowledge comes out, as new strains come out, and we have the power to develop a vaccine for the new strain, I don't know why people were surprised by that.
What are the sources? If I don't know how many you identify in the film, but give us perhaps a couple that are at the top of the list. The sources identified as leading to vaccine hesitancy.
Oh, well, there's an entire community out there, and it's not just one person or one, but there's many. I mean, there's if you look at if you track it back into the when the vaccines first arrived, and then you saw people rising up on the internet. There were people like Del Bigtree. There was Bobby Kennedy. There are people who basically either just didn't trust the authorities. Let me not call them authorities because that's the wrong word. Let me say didn't trust the agencies where their entire goal is to establish what is the efficacy of the vaccines that have been put forth by pharma. And it has hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of medical professionals engaged in these trials and in the research. So what you can say to yourself is, I live in a free country, I'm not going to pay attention to any of that. Well, this is what science is all about, attempting to establish what is objectively true in the world. And look at how much other science we completely depend on. All right? You pick up your smartphone every day. Do you know how much science is in your smartphone? And engineering and technology and space with GPS satellites? But science is all around us. And what has happened, curiously, is that people have cherry-picked what they want to believe and what they don't. When you walk onto an airplane, are you're not saying, well, I don't trust the science. The planes fly, right? So you're living on average twice as long as people did 150 years ago by the developments of modern medicine. So,
right, but I think there's a chasm between, say, Robert Kennedy Jr. and Tony Fauci. There's a lot of infectious disease experts, equally credentialed, equally published, that had a variety of opinions about a multitude of matters under the umbrella COVID. So
that's true. Yeah,
right. So I mean, what? Just let me give you an example. Just if I could just give you an example to what I'm talking about. So Dr. Paul Offit, who's a pediatrician, and he was making the rounds. I think he's one of the medical experts featured in your film.
Yes, he is.
All right. So he was a proponent of vaccinations and so forth when the vaxes were first made available and the push was on. But then in September of last year, he said on CNN that he feared the CDC would recommend a new COVID booster for all when, quote, a healthy young person is unlikely to benefit. He said if there's not clear evidence of benefit, it's not fair to ask people to take a risk, no matter how small. The benefit should be clear. So that's a very different position than we were getting from sort of the gaggle of CDC experts that are omnipresent on cable news. There's gradations in terms of if it makes sense for this cohort or this specific individual or that specific individual. If a booster is necessary, did you have it? Do you have natural immunity? I mean, there's a lot of subordinate questions that are sort of not addressed by people who just say, continue to get the shots in your arm until we say stop.
Yeah, so that's a very important point. And Paul Offit's commentary there was highly insightful regarding the demographics of who needs it most, the vaccine, who needs it most, what are the risk factors of being hospitalized or of dying. And by the way, those risk factors became further and further tuned over the month by month as we saw who was getting affected and who was not, and who was dying especially. And so I think people need to recognize that the moving frontier of science is something that modifies any prior recommendation based on emergent data. And so there is an issue where the CDC is a large organization, yes, and so sometimes their recommendations can be sort of blunt relative to some nuances that someone might invoke. So I think a big issue here is that transcends even those comments is it's one thing for you to say, I don't want to take the vaccine because I'm not at risk, but then you get COVID and then you transmit it to someone who is at risk. And this is the entire problem with infectious diseases. Because at the end of the day, it's not really about you. It's about protecting, it's about public health.
Walensky came out and said if you get vaccinated, you're not going to spread it to anybody else. That was all bull jive. And you know it. So that's why people don't trust science anymore. And when are the experts seriously going to come out and talk about the side effects of the vacces? Because how long are they? I mean, we've got myocarditis. We have a number of elite athletes just dropping dead.
So here's a point that gets lost, and that is when the press reports, when anyone is interviewed, the people listening want some kind of certain answer. Mm-hmm. They want an answer with certainty. Okay, whereas every scientific measurement the results of it is a probabilistic statement.
Yes.
The research paper will report it probabilistically. So what I mean by that, of course, is I don't remember the exact number. Was it this protects 90% of all cases? Will keep you out of the hospital or keep you from dying? Well, that means 10% it does not protect. And do we fully understand why and how? I don't know. But the fact that you can find the exceptions that were consistent with the statistics does not undo the value of the broader statistic that's reported. And so if someone says you're not going to transmit it, they should have never said that, ever, because no data would say it's 100% you're not going to transmit it. They could have said you're less likely to transmit it. And then what are the percentages? And the press and the public, there seems to be less room to receive this kind of nuanced information. And so everybody's in this cauldron thinking that a statistical statement is a certainty, and then when there's an exception to that, then they reject the entire statistical statement.
Well, I got
a problem. It's a problem of communication.
I agree that's a problem if that were the problem, and I'm not sure I agree that that's the problem. And my point to say is this. No, I think what a lot of people, myself included, are looking for is humility, particularly when you're dealing with a novel coronavirus, as you say, and you don't know how the thing is going to mutate. You're making assumptions based on very incomplete data that gets a little bit more complete as you go along. And when those assumptions turn out to be less than accurate, there's not a corrective statement issued, and here's what we know now, and here's what we're still trying to find out. I don't know how many times we had conversations, including with many, many medical experts on this show, where he said, okay, so just give me here's what we know now, and here's what we don't know, what we're trying to figure out, and here's how you should sort of make a risk assessment, because we live in a world of trade-offs. That's the adult world.
That is exactly.
But that's not what happened. Nope.
And that's a failure. That's a communication failure, and that's unfortunate, because then it undermines people's confidence in a system that is designed to protect us. And so, by the way, the CDC changed their head during COVID, right? And we have a bit of that changeover there, where the new head of the CDC, I don't want to say confesses, that overstates it, but she admits that the communication channels and the pace of the communication, what was communicated, how it was communicated, was in deep need of improvement. And so one of the problems is scientists generally, they're in a lab, and then the camera and the microphone rolls. And are they thinking how you're going to hear their information? Do they know how to shape it so that there's no ambiguity? It's a communication problem.
Well,
what about this vaccine?
And it's also a problem of trying to stifle communication, as we see now with the Twitter files. And just to use an example, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who's a former FDA commissioner under Trump and a Pfizer board member, and that's disclosed when he goes on Face the Nation that he's a member of Pfizer board and so on and so forth. But still, And he is in the business, as we have seen many others in the business, of trying to get others to stifle dissenting views from legitimate places. I'm not talking about people that are ideologically anti-vax. I'm talking about, again, equally credentialed scientists and infectious disease experts, but you don't like an opinion that's coming from somebody, and so you run to have that person silenced, whether it's to your friends at a particular network or it's to your friends at social media. And that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence either, because what's the immediate reaction? If you can't deal with that person on the merits, what are you afraid of? What are you trying to hide?
Yeah, so part of it is maybe you can't deal with how good a communicator they are, right? And so, I mean, part of the cesspool that is social media is the people who are the loudest or the most charismatic or the most at the biggest followers aren't always the people who are the most right, but they have the following, and so that puts things that are correct at risk. But
but I'm not talking about a celebrity. I'm talking about like silencing Martin Kulldorff, who's an epidemiologist at Harvard, for God's sakes. I'm not talking about goofballs who don't know anything. I'm talking about people that
right. Okay,
yeah.
That's fair. That's fair. So, by the way, the film, like COVID, is of course a big part of the film, but it's a much deeper storytelling about the value of vaccines in the role of public health, and so. The takeaway is not what side were you on and who did you listen to during COVID, although of course COVID is a major part of the film. It's a general statement about what is our collective duty. Is that the right word? What is our collective obligation to one another?
Yeah.
But never again.
Society safe.
This has never happened in the history of our country. The marketing that went on, we'll come to your house. We'll give you $200 if you get the shot. Free Great America tickets. And and then the vaccine mandates. What was your thought on the vaccine mandates? That if you had to get vaccinated, if you wanted to keep your job, and that's still in place in some parts of the country.
Yeah, so like I said, if your job involves you interacting with other people and you could spread the virus, then so the problem, like you said earlier, is that if the vaccine meant you would never spread the virus, then you wouldn't need the mandates for, in other words, you'd say, well, let me back up. So the risk factors are what people are trying to protect the rest of the population for in the office place or wherever else. So by the way, we've lived with vaccine mandates with schools. You can't, in public schools, you can't enroll your kid unless there's some biological need, some biological requirement that if they get vaccinated, that would be a problem for them. So to enroll your child, we've all grown up with that, right? You're vaccinated against polio and all kinds of things. And so why that would be a problem now, I found
because it's the lowest risk group. It's the lowest. Risk group.
There's a bigger issue though too, and I watched a podcast you were on recently. I think it was called Valuetainment, where you talked about this a bit, and you're getting to it now. And this is a big philosophical question and a big sort of how a free society should be organized question. So I'm glad you tackled it, which is this idea of a social compact. That we have a duty to one another, and that's a nice thing to say, and it's a nice thing to do, generally speaking. But something like that, I always ask the question: so, what, if any, limiting principle is there to that? What, if any, you say, well, you have to get vaccinated because you have to prevent somebody who is at risk from being infected. Not that the vaccine necessarily does that, as we found out, but even if it did,
well, it does, just not 100%. Right, just to be clear,
what is the limiting?
It does, not 100%. So go on.
What is the limiting principle to that?
So that's a great open conversation, and I think again, the epidemiologist who would speak from a much more informed posture than I would on this, but I would say, whatever are those people who cannot be vaccinated, they need to be protected by those of us who can. And that is where you get the herd immunity. the herd immunity, which is a little misnamed by my judgment, but the herd immunity is what percentage of the population would need to be vaccinated so that the rest would be protected. And that is entirely dependent on how contagious the disease is. So measles, for example, which is one of the most contagious, is the herd immunity has to be up in the mid-90% in order to protect the entire population. Other less contagious diseases, that number drops. That would be a sensible sort of objective way to say, if you just have a philosophical objection to vaccines or whatever, and then the hope or the expectation is that enough other people will get vaccinated so that you be protected. That's a possible outcome of this.
We're going to have to leave it there, although I wish we had more time. Hopefully you'll come back because I really enjoyed the conversation. He is Neil deGrasse Tyson.
It's rolling out this year, and it's not officially released yet, but there's a website, shotinthearm.movie.com. And you can see, like I said, the value of the film is, I think it takes a compassionate look at all the vaccine hesitant cases in the black community, where there was the Tuskegee, the abominable
experiments, right?
The Tuskegee study that was an abomination of medical science. So it takes a very open, concerned look at the whole story.
The documentary Shot in the Arm, shotinthearmmovie.com. As you just heard, Neil deGrasse Tyson, astrophysicist. He's the author and executive producer of Shot in the Arm, that new documentary. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
You got it. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line. Coming up on Chicago's Morning Answer.
We'll get your reaction, take some calls on our conversation with Neil deGrasse Tyson at 8:38.
But now into the newsroom we go. Here is Mike Scott.
36 degrees in Chicago, 8:31 is our time, cloudy skies. Ukraine's interior minister and 17 others are dead, killed when a helicopter crashed into a kindergarten